You're listening to the UnSafe Bible with Pastor Ken Brown.
They're not welcome, as it says in verse 9. As a result of their moral and religious conduct, they're bringing violence and deceit into the temple, in a similar way that they've also brought violence and destruction into the city of Jerusalem. So in the world of cosmic geography, which may be involved in this leap over the threshold, Yahweh owns the threshold. They're entering the temple, and they have seriously disqualified themselves from being able to be in it and worship because of other things they're doing.
At a soccer match, the field is reserved for the players. It would be weird if someone from the crowd was on there, and yet it happens all the time. They must get security to get the fans off the field, and usually those people end up spending a night in jail. Today, Pastor Ken says the people in the book of Zephaniah disqualified themselves from entering the temple of God because of their actions. You have full access to God if you believe. He sent His Son so you can have a relationship with Him. Well, let's join Pastor Ken in the book of Zephaniah chapter 1 as he begins his message, The Day of the Lord is Near.
Book of Zephaniah, we're in chapter 1. And again, the whole thing about Zephaniah is the day of the Lord is near. And that's what we're going to be talking about. The day of the Lord is near. Who can endure it? So we're going to be picking up in verse 8 and going through the end of the chapter. Now, last time we were looking at this book, we had already been taken to the end of the millennium. We had witnessed the judgment that takes place on those who rebel against the rule of the Messiah, the rule of Jesus Christ, which we also read in Revelation chapter 20, verses 7 to 10. And we learn about the promised destruction of the planet just prior to the creation of the new heaven and the new earth and the coming down of the new Jerusalem into the eternal state. And that's in Revelation 21, verses 1 to 4. It's also in Zephaniah. Then there's about the impending judgment on Judah. So that's what we spent a little bit of time talking about. And the thing I find amazing as I study this book is that most of what the Lord pointed out that was a problem for Judah is a problem for our culture today. It's a problem here in the West, all of it. Distraction and compromise is what was going on in Judah. And that's what's happening today, only globally. I mean, the enemy, Satan, he knows what works, and he kind of sticks with things that work. And he's been able to do that with Judah, and he's still doing it today. The church, for example, today, globally, is being distracted by the enemy from its primary mission, which is to make disciples, to secondary things. And the things aren't bad in many cases, but it's not what we're here to do. We're here to make disciples, which means making believers and teaching believers the word and growing them in Christ so they can reach others for the Lord. So the Laodicean church is beginning to grow pretty well in these last days as we start seeing people turning away from the Lord and churches turning away from the Lord. That's why it's important for us here at Calvary to make sure that we keep consistently teaching the word chapter by chapter, verse by verse, because that's what we do. Lies of the enemy have impacted a lot of different ministries. There are different ministries now that you really have to, that used to be reliable, but now you have to listen to them very carefully to find out where they stand on biblical truth. All of a sudden, Acts 17:11 is becoming one of those important verses to remember, and you have to exercise it a little more frequently than you used to. Acts 17:11 is when Paul went to the Berea. There he found out that the Jews were more open-minded than those in Thessalonica. They received the message and then examined the scriptures to see if it's true. So that's what we need to be doing. What this is here is Acts 17:11 says, don't believe everything Ken tells you. Check it out in the Bible for yourself to make sure it's really, really there. We need to do that with anything that we listen to, and it's becoming more important these last days. This is why, again, we're committed to discipleship and the teaching of the word at Calvary here in these last days. That's what the church was built on. That's what we were called to do by Jesus. So what we see here in Zephaniah is God is readying himself to destroy all nations, including Judah. So we're talking a little bit more than just a problem that's going on in Judah right now. We're talking about end of the age stuff. And we don't know exactly what he's going to do, but everything's going to be transformed because of the judgment that God is bringing. we are living in the days that Zephaniah is writing about. And that's kind of difficult to understand sometimes, that some of these minor prophets had a lot of viewpoints that bring us into the modern day. And they were seeing things that were going on today. So back to some of the issues in Judah, though, starting in verse 8. It'll come about on the day of the Lord's sacrifice that I'll punish the princes, the king's son, and all who clothe themselves with foreign garments. And on that day, I'll punish all who leap on the temple threshold, who fill the house of the Lord with violence and deceit. Now, we've already talked about the clothing issue. But in Judah, this confusion or syncretic way of living and thinking is reflected not only in, as we've seen, them worshiping Yahweh and then worshiping Molech or Baal or the stars, but there's some practices going on in the temple too that are now being addressed. Leaping on or over the temple threshold, when you look at it, you go, that's kind of weird. That's like walking up to a door and jumping over the threshold and then walking on in. That's what they were doing. It's a bit strange, but when you know what it says in Psalm 15 and 24, you have to start asking the question, are these people doing it because they know they've disqualified themselves from being able to even enter the temple? They may have done that, including the Levites who work in the temple. So what are the conditions? In Psalm 24, the conditions are this. They start in verse 3. He who has clean hands and a pure heart, so this is what they have to have, who does not lift up his soul to what is false and does not swear deceitfully. So if they're worshiping false gods, they've run afoul of that. In Psalm 15, starting in verse 1 to verse 3, we read the Lord saying, he who walks blamelessly and does what is right and speaks truth in his heart, who does not slander with his tongue and does no evil to his neighbor, nor take up a reproach against his friend. Those are qualifications to be able to go into the temple. And when you read this jumping over the threshold, there is one other place in the Bible that immediately comes to mind. It's in 1 Samuel chapter 5 in the temple of Dagon. Now, Eli made a really, really bad mistake. He said, let's send the Ark of the Covenant into battle against the Philistines. Well, the Philistines captured it, and it fell into their hands, and they took it to Ashdod and installed it in the temple of their god, Dagon. And what we do is we learn about something they believed called cosmic geography, where Yahweh's presence in that temple did damage to the statue of Dagon and then destroyed the statue of Dagon. So 1 Samuel chapter 5, verse 5 describes the reaction of the priests of Dagon and all who come into the house of Dagon. Do not tread on the threshold of Dagon in Ashdod until this very day. Why? Because God had shown up in the temple of Dagon, and they believed that the threshold, which is where Dagon's statue fell, now belonged to Yahweh. So as they would walk in, they would jump over it because that wasn't Dagon's property, that's Yahweh's property, and they didn't want to do anything with Yahweh, which is weird, but that's what they believed. Now, cosmic geography, as we talk about it, and as it's showing up here in the scriptures, was very important to people living in that day and age. It's not the cosmology we're talking about, it's what they actually believed. Their understanding of the supernatural world and the spiritual world, they actually believed that certain locations were under the dominion of specific divine beings. So Gath, which is Philistine, would be under control of Dagon, whereas Jerusalem, which was under the control of Yahweh, well, that's Yahweh. That's why Jonah headed for the hills, because he thought Yahweh was only in Israel, and he found out he's actually everywhere. So he got a lesson in reality from that. But this all comes from changes that took place at Bethel in Genesis 11. This goes that far back. In Genesis chapter 11, everybody's living together, everybody's speaking one single language, and they were told by the Lord to be fruitful and fill the planet. Well, they weren't being that obedient. They were deciding to stay in a little valley located in what is today Iraq and basically build a giant tower so they could replicate Genesis chapter 6 all over again. They wanted to rebel. So we read in chapter 11 of Genesis, verse 7, "Come, let's go down and confuse the people with different languages Then they won't be able to understand each other, and in that way the Lord scattered them all over the world, and they stopped building the city. That's why the city was called Babel, because that's where the Lord confused the people with different languages, and he scattered them all over the world. So all of a sudden you have 70 language groups running around where you used to have one. Kind of tough to get anything done when you were speaking Hebrew one day and and your neighbor was speaking Hebrew, and the next day he speaks Chinese and you speak German or whatever those proto-languages were at that time. We covered this in detail when we did our study in the unseen realm. Long story short, the nations rebelled against Yahweh and those instructions that were given to them in Genesis chapter 9, verse 2. Now, because of that, God assigned the nations to members of his divine council and then turned to create a new people from this idol worshiper named Abram, who lived in Ur of the Chaldees. But we read in Deuteronomy 32, verses 8 and 9, how that happened. The Most High assigned lands to the nations when he divided up the human race. That's in Genesis 11. He established the boundaries of the people according to the number in his heavenly court. For the people of Israel belong to the Lord. Jacob is his special possession. So we see why they're subdivided and why they wind up being under these different members of the divine council who were just supposed to just kind of watch over them and make sure they didn't do anything stupid. Instead, they all rebelled, the members of the divine council. They sided with Satan, and then they began demanding worship themselves. So the guy who was overseeing the Philistines, he now says, I'm Dagon, worship me. And then another one starts saying, oh no, I'm Molech, worship me. And this is what was going on in the unseen realm. We discover that they're condemned by Yahweh for this action in Psalm 82, but the God of one people asserted geographic control, as did the God of another. I mean, this is what's going on. And these fallen divine beings were actually fighting each other. So that's where some of this warfare came from, too. So that's why when you see the Philistines take the Ark of the Covenant, they thought they had just defeated that country's God, and they took that God to their God. And the Babylonians did the same thing. The Assyrians did the same thing. This is a common practice in the Middle East. Psalm 82, verses 6 to 8, the Lord talks about all those fallen divine beings who were asserting themselves as saying that, oh, they need to worship us. The Lord told them, you're gods, little g, you're all children of the Most High. In other words, they were created beings by him. And he says, but you're going to die like mere mortals and fall like every other ruler. Rise up, O God, and judge the earth, for all the nations belong to you. So now we see ultimately who actually owns it all. It's Yahweh. He owns everything. Now, that's a lot of background for this little weird statement, jumping over the threshold, but I wanted us to kind of think like they would think back in Zephaniah's day. This is one of those things where you have to kind of think like a Jew. It's the result of God's judgment on the nations at Babel. It's the backdrop for Israel's struggle. And it sets the stage for the gospel, too. The good news is that Jesus' work on the cross is that the people of God are no longer only Jews, but now all who believe in Jesus. And as we go out, and this is why we're making disciples, as we go out and make disciples, we are going into territory that once belonged to these other fallen divine beings, and we're regaining control for it for the Lord, and we're bringing it all into the kingdom of God at that point. Does that make sense? It's kind of weird, but it's one of those concepts that, the lesson is the world's not our home. This is not home. This is not home. Darkness is all over the globe, and when believers get together, it's like little lights shining, which is what we are. Unbelievers are essentially hostages of spiritual forces. We need to remember that, and the only thing that can set them free is the gospel of Jesus Christ. Nothing else can set them free. Satan has them hoodwinked, and he has them captured, and they don't know they can be set free. That's why we have to tell them about the Lord. By the way, this is all very real. Seems kind of fantastical sometimes when you think about it, but it's part of the understanding that they would have in Israel at this time. Now, again, for the Philistines, this idea of cosmic geography was very real. They're jumping over the threshold after all of the situation involving the Ark of the Covenant and Dagon's statue being destroyed. They would leap over this threshold, entering the temple of Dagon, because now it belongs to Yahweh, not Dagon. So now you fast forward up to Zephaniah's time period. And they're seeing this going on in the temple. You've got folks jumping over the threshold, walking into the temple of Yahweh. And these are people who are coming in to worship Yahweh. Well, it appears that those who worshiped other gods, in addition to Yahweh, may have been practicing this act, but there's more to this. Who are the ones who would be jumping over the threshold? I'll show you that here in a second. Those who leap over the threshold could be construed as persons who, for reasons outlined in Zephaniah 1, are not allowed to enter the sacred realm of the temple. They are now disqualified per what we read in the Psalms, or because they're worshiping false gods. They're not welcome, as it says in verse 9. As a result of their moral and religious conduct, they're bringing violence and deceit into the temple, in the similar way that they've also brought violence and destruction into the city of Jerusalem. So in the world of cosmic geography, which may be involved in this leap over the threshold, Yahweh owns the threshold. They're entering the temple, and they have seriously disqualified themselves from being able to be in it and worship because of other things they're doing. The clothing reference could be part of that too. Maybe they're still wearing the same clothes that they worship Molech or Baal in. We don't know. But here's the problem. The predominant number of the offenders are Levitical priests, because they're the only ones who would be going over the threshold. Most people cannot go into the holy place. The priests are the offenders? Oh yeah, for the most part that is a yes. Only the priests can enter the temple proper. They're the only ones who can enter the holy place. They're the only ones who have to go in and change out the table of showbread once a week. They're the ones that have to go in and keep the altar of incense burning every day. They have to make sure that the menorah remains lit, and they're checking that every day. And the door inside the porch is where the threshold is. On the other side of the curtain, once you walk into the holy place, at the back of the room, there's this curtain, and in there is the Ark of the Covenant, and they only go in there once a year after a whole lot of preparation. But they would be entering the holy place several times a day, and they thought no one was watching. And Zephaniah says, and about you guys jumping over the threshold, somebody's watching. Because everybody else is in the courtyard. Again, this is what the temple looked like at that time. Most folks, when they worship, they're outside the temple. They're in the courtyard. They're worshiping there. The only folks going in over the threshold are priests. This is a problem. You start wondering when you have people who are responsible for worshiping the Lord and teaching what the Lord's word says, and they're busy being compromised, then what's happening to the people? And this speaks to today. It's the same compromise that we see happening. Because of this, we wind up seeing a discussion of the day of the Lord. Now, Judah, like our modern society in this so-called post-Christian era, believed that a new situation that they had with getting along with all these foreign countries demanded that they had to be practical and demanded that they had to compromise in some areas. So they'd had these other gods that were in town. They had already had refugees show up from Israel when Israel was conquered by the Assyrians. So you have these false priests and false gods already in town. You've got those false god worshipers in town. And they're just being practical. We got to get along with these guys. We got to get along with Assyria. We got to get along with Egypt. We need to compromise and move into the modern day. That's kind of what they were thinking. I mean, after all, Assyria is ruling this day, and if one's wise, you got to be pleasant and accommodating as possible to those who hold the reins of power, to one's boss or one's social leader or organization or government officials, right? This is the way they're thinking. Ancient commandments in their minds, delivered by an unseen God, held little force and importance in a world that was run by human powers. And they're not being run by human powers. There's other powers behind those people. The differences between us and the people of Judah, do they look that different? I mean, you start looking at what's going on in the Israel of Zephaniah's time, and then you start looking at what's going on today, and you're going like, they're about the same. There's not a lot of difference. Verse 10, and on that day, declares the Lord, There will be a sound of a cry from the fish gate. Now, on that day, he's talking about the day that Judah is taken and Jerusalem is taken. There'll be a sound of a cry from the fish gate, wailing from the second quarter, and a loud crash from the hills. Wail, you inhabitants of the mortar, because all the people of Canaan will be destroyed. All who weigh out silver will be eliminated. Now, this is a picture of an invading army that is coming from the north. We're talking about an entry point into Jerusalem and then a path to the Temple Mount. Judgment's not going to spare anybody in the city, and economic status will not be of benefit to any economic class. It doesn't matter how much money you have or don't have. Everyone's going to be judged the same. Now, the fish gate is what we today call the Damascus gate. It exists. It's to the north and at the edge of the Tyropoeon Valley, which is there's a little valley that goes through that portion of Jerusalem. And that was the gate that if you were bringing in fish from the Sea of Galilee, that's where they brought them. That's why it was called the fish gate. They would sell the fish right there at the fish gate. It's located on the north side of the city of Jerusalem. Oh, it's also the gate that Nebuchadnezzar came in. Okay? But as you look at a photograph of it, you see the fish gate, and you notice the Dome of the Rock is very visible using this long lens. You can see both of them. You had to go through the north quarter and the mortar to get there. So what we're getting described for us is the path that the Babylonian army is going to take when they go into Jerusalem. The second quarter is the area northwest of the temple, and we saw that. It's between those 2 points. It's the newest part of Jerusalem at the time of the attack. They had just added some additions to Jerusalem. Manasseh did some of the building, and Josiah finished it. So this is what we're talking about. The army would progress, would enter via the fish gate at the north end of the Tyropoeon Valley. And that's where the army of the Babylonians would actually come in. And the sound of the crashing of the hills, that's the sound of the army as they approach. They can hear it because the sound is bouncing off the hills as they hear them come. The next location, which is the mortar, there's a small valley between the second quarter and the Temple Mount, and it was very popular for all the merchants to gather together. And it fits the context for this. The action moves from the northern gate to the second quarter, and now you're coming to the Temple Mount. But before you get to the Temple Mount, you come to this little area of merchants who have got money and goods and everything for sale. It's a thoroughfare on the way to the temple, and it makes sense to be a commercial site there. But why the comment about these being people of Canaan rather than being called citizens of Jerusalem? Well, it could be because these are folks who live in the shadow of the temple, but they no longer worship Yahweh and they want nothing to do with him because they're busy worshiping their God, which is money, and they're selling stuff. So that could be part of it. We don't know. It could also be that they're all merchants and none of them are from Judah. They're all foreigners. That's possible too. Or at the end of the day, they're just merchants who are busy worshiping money and selling things, and then their God is money, and so they're called Canaanites. And I think that makes more sense when you start looking at the context of this verse. Merchants and those with money trusted in their riches, and now God is promising to cut down those who are involved in that kind of idolatry. The merchants, he says here, will be totally wiped out. And there's some interesting words that start getting used. The word here is nikaratu, using the base word karat, which is the same word that Daniel uses when he is told by Gabriel that Messiah will be cut off in Daniel 9:16. He will be karat, cut off.
You've been listening to the latest edition of the UnSafe Bible with Pastor Ken Brown. As Pastor Ken continues to go through these minor prophet books, there's a lesson and a message to be learned from each one. Zephaniah spoke boldly as a prophet during his time. Did you realize that he was a prophet during King Josiah's time? That means that he grew up during the years of evil and wicked rule of Manasseh and Amon. God used Zephaniah to speak to the people about God's coming judgment and to give hope for something restored at a later time. Zephaniah used the term, the day of the Lord, more than any other Old Testament book. This was a reference to the coming fall of Jerusalem to Babylon, and also the prediction of a greater judgment on the world as a whole in the future. These prophecy books are not something to take lightly, and they don't apply to things in the past. They're very much there for our instruction and for things that are still ahead. If you'd like to listen to this message again, you can find it at theunsafebible.com. In fact, if you want to listen to more teachings from this book or any of the other minor prophet books, just look for them on our website. This ministry comes to you from Hobe Sound, Florida, and we feel truly blessed to have had you with us today. We trust that you're growing in new and interesting ways each time you tune in. Stay tuned for the next message from Zephaniah, as Pastor Ken has much to share. We thank you for your support and your listening ear, here on the UnSafe Bible.